Here we are in Blender 2.76 at the moment B, and it's not important to the version you've got because we're going to be looking at color correction and color balancing. That's color grading, and we're going to hop straight into the node editor, activate the scene and use nodes and backdrops. So we're going to look at that. We don't need the render layers, and we're going to pull out this window and down just so I can have a viewer, change it into a UV image editor and render. We have nothing because we've got nothing connected, so let's add in an input of just an image to get started with. We're going to open that, and we have here some color bars so that we can plug those in and see what we've got. We're also going to put it up to 100% size, re-render that, and there we have our color bars. Some color for us to work with. Here is our perfect white, perfect black, and the colors in between. Perfect green, perfect blue, perfect red, and the three in betweens. In the UV image editor, when we have an output through the compositor here, if we click this plus, we get a sidebar here, and there we have where the scopes are. These are useful because you can see exactly what's happening in your video and not having to rely on your monitor being calibrated correctly or that your eye might be incorrect. These are more objective rather than subjective. In the histogram up here, it gives you a representation of the colors. Here is your all three colors. There's your red, greens, blues, and your alpha channel. We won't be needing that for the moment. That is for later on. What we do want to see is the waveform. The waveform monitor is the monitor that shows you the representation of the luminance. That means the brightness. At the top means it's full brightness. At the bottom of the graph is black or no brightness at all. And each of the colors you can see in different steps that they have different intensities of light according to the color they have. Below that we have the vector scope. The vector scope is a representation of color, where the waveform monitor is a representation of the luminance or the brightness. The vector scope is a representation of the color. And you can see we have a bunch of circles. In the middle we've got black, and the further out you go, the brighter the color is, or the more saturated the color is. You have some little boxes here, and those boxes, as you can see by the color bars, represent where those individual colors on the color bars are supposed to sit when things are calibrated properly. When we have up here we have the reds, down here we have the greens, and here we have the blues, and you can see that they sit exactly in the middle of that little box. It means that the saturation is perfect, the coloring, the hue angle is correct, and everything is correct. Black being in the middle and white's way out at the edge there. And those three spots here, or those spots that are in the middle, are the other colors that are a mixture of those other ones. Now, to be able to adjust those, let's take a look at another picture that is not color bars to see how it looks on the scope. Here's a picture that we have to look at, and you can see that the representation of the luma here, we find that our whites here are not right up to 100%. They're a little bit low, and our blacks are just tipping it right, more or less, and our greys are a good block in the middle. It means that we could do a color correction on that to increase the intensity of our whites to maximum so that we have a proper spread of blacks, whites, and greys. And here we also have a representation of the color. You can see that we've got quite a bit of green and the yellows and oranges, which is quite true. Up to the reds we have a nice blob of red, but we have very few blues and purples and magentas and colors like that. The intensity is not too bad. It's a little bit more desaturated, but that's okay. Let's see what we can do to change that. In a color correction, we have a whole bunch of tools at our disposal, In the Add menu and Color, we have all of these. We have the Mix node, Alpha Over node, and the Invert node, which are to mix things together and invert the colors, of course. We use those in other times, but they don't do anything to the color as such except the Mix node. The Tone Map and the Z Combine are to do with 3D, so we won't be using those for the moment. The first one we can look at is the Brightness and Contrast. It's probably the simplest of all of them. If we put that into the line, everything that is on these nodes will be in the side panel here, which we can open close with this little plus sign to do that, and look at the scopes. If we increase the brightness a little bit, not much is going to happen to the colors, but our brightness will, of course. You can see in the picture that all of the blacks have gone greyish and the whites have stayed fairly much where they are. It means that we have lifted the blacks, they've gone up. If we lower those the opposite into the negatives, the blacks will drop right down off the scope and the whites have stayed more or less where they are. So you're lifting your blacks by changing the brightness. Let's put it back to 1. Our contrast is the difference between how the gradient between your darkest and your lightest. And putting the contrast up has taken our blacks down also. So you're sort of playing with your blacks. If we go into the negatives, it will raise all of that and make the gradient between the blacks and the whites less. So it makes those blacks grayer once again. So you're playing with the blacks mostly. That's our brightness and contrast. Select and delete that. The next one to look at is the color hue, saturation, and value. Now that node, we have 3 parameters once we put them in, and the amount that we're going to be doing it. Looking on our scope, you can see the hue is, of course, the color. If you look at here on the vector scope, you can see the colors. The hue, if I raise the hue, you are changing the angle of that hue. The colors more or less stay the same, but they will rotate around the angle of the colors, just like in the fast color corrector in Adobe Premiere. There's a ring around the outside of the color wheel, which you can change the hue angle. So you can change the angle of where those colors are positioned. And if we go around, it'll change over to here somewhere, I expect, and change the hue angle. The saturation, if we put them up or down, you're going to adjust how vibrant those colors are. They've shot out here, and as you can see, they're very bright. They're still not excessive, but they're pretty gaudy, of course. And if you then go into the negatives, it will reduce the saturation and they will shrink back towards the blacks in the middle, back into the blacks and greys, and shrink. So you can see how much saturation you've got there with your vector scope. Now, the value will not affect the color as such, but it will change the brightness values of the waveform monitor. And if we go into the negatives, it's going to lower the brightnesses. As you can see, it's lowered that. So you can get your value up to where the whites are white, the blacks. Just like the contrast and brightness was able to raise and lower the blacks, the value node can raise and lower the whites, or the brights, or the highlights. So you can play around with those 3 to make sure that your whites are white and your blacks are black and your greys are in the middle. You can change the saturation and also the hue as well. So that's the hue, saturation, value node. The next one to look at in your tools is your color correction node. Now we are still in color correction, and the difference between color correction and color balance is color correction you are adjusting just the blacks, whites and greys with very little to do with the colors, except in this case we do have a parameter which is doubled up from the other nodes, the saturation. We can work on just the red, the green and the blue channels, or all together. Just like on the saturation value and hue node, the saturation will change the saturation. Contrast will also be like the contrast and brightness node, changing those. But the difference here is we have three possibilities for changing the gamma, gain and lift. Gamma is to do with all the grays. Gain is to do with your highlights. And your lift is to do with your shadows. So you can change each one of those individually, the highlights, midtones and shadows of those three. So you've got 9 parameters to adjust different parts of your waveform. That's the luminance. For example, if we were to put up our gamma, you will see that the grays will rise, but the whites and the blacks will stay more or less the same. Right. Now, if we were to lower those, the gamma, the midtones then drop by leaving the whites and blacks more or less where they were also. One is right in the middle. Gain will be the highlights. So my whites at the top will raise. So if I go 1.2, the whites will lift, so we can raise it to the point where the picture is going to be with our whites right at the top, our blacks stay the same and the greys are okay. So now our white balance has been set and our blacks are looking not too bad, but if we wanted to change those, we could go either a little bit above the 0 and only little bits like 0.07. That will lift the blacks there. So if we needed to adjust our blacks, we would do it here in the lift, or we could lower our blacks and that will obviously drag it down and off the scale. I think the blacks are okay on this particular shot, so we'll just put it at 0. And our whites needed a little bit of adjustment there also to get it up there. So now our blacks and whites and greys have been corrected. That is color correction, correcting the luminance. Now the color, as you can see, is not particularly wonderful. It's sort of pinky orangey and gaudy and all the rest of it. And you can also see down on here in our saturation, we could actually lessen that a little bit, say by 0.8, and that's washed out a bit. We can play around with that and put it back to 1, I think. The next one we want to look at is starting to look at actual color. This is what you call color balancing, because we're going to balance the color, or color grading, they sometimes say. The next one we're going to look at is the color balance node. Now this one here, as you can see, has color, 3 color wheels. Join that in to the image and into the composite and see what information it's going to give us. Nothing has changed really. It's the same as before. Now, just like the color correction node, we do have some overlap here. In these gray sliders here, we have the ability to adjust the black and white balancing. We can raise that or lower that by raising or lowering the slider to effect, just like in the color correction node, the lift are the shadows, gamma the midtones, and the gain the highlights. So I lifted those the blacks in the lift, which is the shadows, and so therefore my blacks raised. I can go to my gain and say I want to lower my highlights, and they will drop by lowering them, or I can put them up slightly and do my color correction very roughly here from this node. That should go back up to something good, slightly off the scale. And our grays, if I was to put them up or lower them, the blacks will stay the same, whites will stay the same, and our grays should drag upwards. And they've dragged the blacks a little bit as well. Individually on those, we can click the box there, and you can see that all of these travel at more or less the same distance to as grays, with no color difference. That's just your grays all lined up like that. So we can go and put them back to the center by going 1 in the red channel and 1 in the blue, and that will have brought us back to the mid-grey mid-tone here. We can, when we raise and lower those, numerically you want them all basically the same. But because it's a color balance node, we can now start changing the colors. For example, by picking on the wheel here different values of green, red, and blue to get different colors in the shadows, mids, and highlights here. And as you can see, all the shadows have turned nice and green in that case, and all our midtones, we could turn them all blue, for example. And you should start to see the difference here showing up on the vector scope. And here are your greens down here, and let's make our highlights all pinky colored. And there we are. So you can play around with changing the shadows, midtones, and highlights of their color as well as their color correction by using the sliders or the box to be more precise. Select and delete that. Now we're going to add the next one. Excuse me. The next one is the color the next one is the Hue Correct. The Hue Correct node, where did it go? Sorry. Once we connect that one in, you can see on the graph here that they have points that you can now select any of the color ranges or the hues in the picture and raise or lower them, increase or decrease them individually. Now you see I raised the green and those greens shot off sideways. It's more into the yellows and greens. If I wanted it perfectly in the center, I can do that more precisely with those spots, and you will see it change more down here. And there we are. Or I could get rid of all those greens if I just wanted to be selective in getting rid of just the greens. They will shrink down, and you'll see in the picture here that all my grass has disappeared, leaving everything else the same. So you can be very selective in which colors you increase or decrease. That gives you a bit of scope to play with. That gives you a little bit of scope. The next one to look at is in the color Rgb Curves. Oh, gamma is just gamma, of course. It's just very limited. And the Rgb Curves is one that we can use to adjust mostly luma, but you have the choice of all three channels, just your red channel, green or blue, and adjusting them individually. On the graph here, you have your darks in one corner and your lights in the other corner. So, and your grays in the middle, of course. If we go, it won't change the color much unless you're doing individual channels. But on the waveform monitor, if I put a spot in the middle and drag that upwards, my grays will lift and my whites and blacks stay exactly the same. If I lower them, it will do the opposite, of course. If we select that dot and use the X, we can get rid of it, just to get it set it back to where it was before. And since this corner is our blacks, we can do a color correction, that means luma correction, by grabbing that spot and dragging it, if it will let me, up the wall of the graph, and it will raise my black level. So you can do a rough black level correction there, or drag it on along the bottom, and it will drag it down off the bottom of the graph. If we take the top spot, that's our whites, and move it across the top of there, it will raise our white levels. And so this is another way that you can adjust your white levels so that you've got your brightest colors at the highest point, or you can slide that point down there to lower them, of course. So there is a quick way of adjusting your color correction, just your blacks, whites and grays. Even quicker is to go to your black level, click this button, get the eyedropper, and click somewhere in the picture that is supposed to be black, and it will pick a color for you. Obviously I picked a green rather than a black. And similarly do the same thing with a white. This is your quick pick basically to get a very quick luminance color correction. And there we have it. Now what happens if we have a color in the grays? We've got our whites properly and our blacks properly, as you can see, but maybe there's like a green cast in it or something like that. We can go to add color and use the mix node. And if we put that in the line, and get if we have add output viewer and connect our picture into the viewer so we can see it on this back screen here. Letter V, zoom out a bit. In that box on the mix node, click it and get the eyedropper and pick somewhere grey that you think is representative of the grey, and change that to divide. And it will basically divide everything by that color. But if you have a situation where there's a color that you don't want, for example, if the sky was a strange color, you could pick on there and see what it picked at. And it picked everything basically. It picked pretty much a white. But if we had a color which was slightly off, like this green here, it will now divide every color that's in the picture by that green and thereby cancel it out. And so it basically is removing that green, and that's why all the red is started to wash out. See there, we've got green. Let's set it back up to full and see what the vector scope does. With divide. When it's white, it goes back to normal. Now, if I was to pick just that little green, we can see that that green will disappear and divide and make all that red increase over this side here, that red and green. So your doing sort of like the opposite, which is similar to the Premiere one. If you wanted to actually add that in, instead of dividing, you can multiply it, which is there. And that will now multiply every pixel by that color, and it will do the opposite. It will increase the greens, of course. You can then use the factor button to increase or decrease the amount of multiplying it's going to do. And you should also check, now that it has darkened up the picture sometimes, the multiply does, make sure that that is right up at its brightest so that it is going to give you there. So you can add a color cast to your picture or take it away by multiplying it. Now, that is color balancing, because you're trying to balance up the colors in the picture. There's one where they call color grading, which is color balancing, but is a sort of an artistic way of dealing with the picture. One quick way to do that is to go to none of the color nodes, but through in a converter node, and put in a color ramp. The color ramp basically is all of your colors ranging from black and white, from black to white, in giving you your grays. What you can do is click the plus and add another one, and you can click on the little triangle and move it up and down, and you can add as many of these as you like, and those are the grays at the moment. If you click on the box, you can pick a color. So let's pick a blue, for example, and that will add a whole bunch of blue to everything. Let's click another one and put another one in here, and we can drag it anywhere you like. You can be creative and play around with that. Click on this one, and we're going to turn this, say, orange, for example. Let's put an orange color in. And that means that our blacks are still blacks, our semi-darks are now orange, our blues are here, and our whites are white. Let's put in another one here, a little bit more blue again. Say a green color, just for fun. Okay, now we're going to get a bit of a rainbow effect. Now it looks terrible still, until we put a mix node in, add color mix, and mix our original footage on top of it, and adjust that, and it will give you an interesting mix of that gaudy color with the new color. Another interesting, you can play around with the mix blend types. For example, one up here, soft light. We'll add those in an interesting way. Reduce the factor quite a bit. And put the clamp on. And play around with it a little bit, and you can get an interesting effect of adding a different color grade to it, so that now, with one on top of the other, it's added that color scheme to it, but not too drastically, to give it a different graded feel to it. And there we have it. So you can play around with all of those and all of those tools to do your color correction, which is your luminance levels, using your waveform monitor to check all of that, and then your color grading, which is your coloring, which you are going to check with your vector scope as well, and some artistic ways of doing it. Have fun with color.